would say, let's start and say, who comes? The door is open. No? We leave it open. So then I will say, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. This is the afternoon lecture with Hakem Al-Rustom from AUC Cairo, and I will introduce him in the talk in a couple of minutes, but will briefly say what is the broader series of talks that we are part of this afternoon. My name is Sami Khatib. I also did the exchange with AUC, AUB this semester, and we are already in the second year now of a very fruitful, productive collaboration of the American University in Cairo and the American University of Beirut, namely the Center of Arts and Humanities and the School of Humanities and Sciences. I think for you it's already the second year, second consecutive year of coming to Beirut. I was there in Cairo last week, twice actually, for a lecture on Benjamin and joining your discussions on Benjamin and also on Edward Said. And I think this collaboration will go on, and I'm very happy that you could make it also this semester to Beirut. A couple of words. Today I have to excuse the chair actually of the Center for Arts and Humanities. Maher Jarrah unfortunately couldn't make it. He sends his warmest wishes. He cannot make it for urgent medical reasons, and he would love to participate, but luckily I see we are being recorded, so maybe he can see it later. Without further ado, I think we will just I will just introduce you and the title of your lecture this afternoon, and then we will have refreshments and also time for Q&A. And at 5 we have, I think, to stop because there will be another lecture at 5:30 with Mitchell. So you can of course stay with us. I think it will be an interesting lecture as well. So your title, the title of your lecture this afternoon is The Forerunner as Critic on John the Baptist and the Work of the Secular Intellectual. And Hakem is in Cairo assistant professor of anthropology and the director of the graduate program in sociology and anthropology at the American University in Cairo. And he is the co-editor of Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation, and currently working on a book manuscript on ethnographic silences and indigenous politics among the Armenians of Turkey. And without further ado, I give the word to you, and I'm very excited to hear your take on John the Baptist.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to be talking about a biblical figure as secular. But before I start, there are a couple of things that I want to say. That I'm very grateful to the work of the center, Meher and Rita, for making not only the visit but the entire collaboration between the two campuses very smooth and fruitful. I've been learning a lot, and to Sami, who's guided our Walter Benjamin reading and throughout this year, that made me rethink the work of Edward Said in new light. So basically, what I have today is an experimental piece. It's not an essay; it's more like meditations on a theme. And especially, I want, since we're talking about the criticism and the work of the secular intellectual, I would like to start by expressing solidarity with everyone in the region who's been facing arbitrary arrest at this time. So one of the most central figures in the Christian tradition is that of John the Baptizer of Jesus. His centrality to the gospel narratives of the life of Jesus came from the fact that he was the precursor to Jesus, both in birth and in public life. He was born 6 months before Jesus and started preaching in the wilderness also before Jesus did. The canonical Gospels maintain that John and Jesus' lives were not simultaneous, and their encounter was very short. Their actual meeting was limited to Jesus' baptism by John in the river Jordan. While the Gospels maintain Jesus' superiority to John, some biblical scholars argue that Jesus was in fact a disciple of John, and this is why he baptized him. As a rite of passage, baptism takes place on one's body as an initiation into a group that signifies one's membership, discipleship, and change in behavior, attitude, and lifestyle. Something that John emphasized in his teachings. He told people who came out to see him in the wilderness to change their behavior to match their newly acquired membership into his group of disciples. Jesus was apparently one of them. The gospel narratives suggest that Jesus' public life started after he was baptized by John, and that shortly before John ended his by imprisonment. Following his beheading, John's disciples joined those of Jesus. John was the forerunner, a precursor, whose role was to prepare the way. John's message and disciples converged in that of Jesus, where one leads to the other. John gave birth to Jesus as the Messiah, and Jesus embodied and continued John's message in biblical Palestine. I built my meditations on the gospel narratives rather than biblical scholarship to understand the representation of John the Baptist as a critic forerunner who did not desire an official post or public recognition, but gives birth to a movement, to a revolution. It is notable that when the public that came to see him mused on whether he was the Messiah or not, he denied such speculation, saying that he only prepares the way for the one who is mightier than he was. A voice in the wilderness. This is how John is described. He was so much identified with his message. He was not simply a carrier of a message, but through his life and example, he himself was the message. It is also notable that the various Christian traditions, especially the Eastern Orthodox, about which I'm most familiar, have focused on John's theological significance as the messianic forerunner and haven't given enough attention to the short yet powerful teaching principles. So what is this message, and how could we retell the story of John embedded in our contemporary experiences? I aim to shed light on John's story as a forerunner, critic, and a secular intellectual. The gospel storytellers propose to their readers to situate the life of the Baptist in the Jewish prophetic tradition by quoting Isaiah's prophecy, quote, "A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him," unquote. John the Baptist actualizes the Jewish prophetic tradition and prepares the way for the Messiah. He's neither the Messiah, nor is he just a prophet. He's a bridge between the two, carrying on the prophetic while pointing towards the messianic as a prophetic fulfillment. According to Luke's gospel that I mostly use today, he says, quote, "The people were waiting expectantly and were all wondering in their hearts if John might possibly be the Messiah. John answered to them all, 'I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I will come, the straps of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit.'" Just a footnote that biblical scholars, since John was baptized, Jesus was baptized by John in a way that he was his disciple, the gospel narrators have made a point to emphasize the superiority of Jesus in those narratives, and that's the context of this. But I'm not building it on biblical scholarship right now. Here the Baptist has presented himself unambiguously as a forerunner. He is not the awaited Messiah. He claims no formal or religious or social title and makes no claims to prophecy. He is simply a precursor to the one who is to come, a pointer. The image of the precursor is invoked by Georgi Lukács as he describes the essayist as, quote, a pure instance of the precursor, unquote, which Edward Said invokes in his conclusion to his essay, The Text, the World, and the Critic. Lukács sees the critical essay as a moment of creation, as a new way to critique. Building on this image, Said sees the critic as a precursor whose position, he says, is, in his words, a vulnerable one because he awaits and prepares for a great aesthetic revolution whose result, ironically enough, will render him marginal. In the very act of creating social critical stances, the critic makes available new possibilities for the future. The critic, her or himself, inhibits this liminal point where, in the present, the past is being critiqued, inaugurating new future possibilities. John the Baptist is a precursor. As a precursor, is a critic who inaugurates new future possibilities in the very practice of criticizing the present. Such criticism builds also on old stories, concepts, and counsels as the prophetic in John's story. Take, for example, John's teaching as narrated in Luke, and I precisely choose Luke because Luke is the only gospel storyteller who emphasized the social justice element in the teaching. He says, every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. What should we do? The crowd asked. John answered, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with the one who has none, and anyone who has food should do the same. Even the tax collectors came to be baptized. Teacher, they asked, what should we do? He said, don't collect any more than you are required to. Then some soldiers asked him, and what should we do? He replied, don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay. Just to give you an idea, because these few lines is basically what we know about the teachings of John the Baptist. We have no other record, and Luke's being the longest. Nothing of what John the Baptist said was new in the prophetic Jewish tradition. But it was the context, the state of the speaker and the listeners at the time that make people wanting to change and to transform. In this sense, one could possibly imagine the Baptist as a Benjaminian storyteller who joins the ranks of teachers and sages, who retells known stories, who gives counsels, and opens up new venues of perceptions and interpretations. In his last wreath lecture, Gods That Always Fail, Edward Said spoke of an unnamed Iranian friend who was an adamant critic of the Shah, and later became an ambassador in several European capitals defending the Islamic Republic. Following the hostage crisis, Said's friend resigned from his ambassadorial position, and upon his return to Iran, became an ambassador to Iran's first president, Bani Sadr. Few months later, following a conflict between the president and the supreme leader, Khomeini, Bani Sadr and Said's friend went into exile. Both could no longer represent and defend the Islamic Republic, for which they once were its foremost supporters. Exiled from Iran, Said's friend turned from a defender of the Islamic Republic to a sharp critic of its leadership. The change in political stance was reflective of his consistency vis-à-vis power. He was a critic of the Shah, later the Imam. Said explains, he hasn't lost his critical sense, both of Iran's highest authority, the Shah and the Imam, and also of American imperialism at the time. However, to the surprise of many, including Said, his friend, like many European leftist intellectuals, and you probably know about Said's writings and conflict with Christopher Hitchens, supported the American invasion of Iraq, saying, in a conflict between imperialism and fascism, one should always pick imperialism. Interesting choice. Here Said raises the question of why would someone who refused to bend to the Shah and the Imam would deem it necessary to make a choice between equally exploitative ideologies, or to use Said's words, political gods or political deities. Why wouldn't he reject both fascism and imperialism as he did with the Shah and the Imam? And why would someone choose to bend to and worship a political god after having maintained independence in relation to power? For Said, the secular intellectual refuses both. Now I turn back to John's teaching to reflect on the practice of the secular critic. A quote from Luke's Gospel. John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham." Here I want to focus on John's statement that out of the stones God can raise up children of Abraham as an instant of secular criticism in the Saidian sense. Said advocated the virtue of secular criticism in his introduction to the world, the text, and the critic. The moral responsibility of the intellectual as being secular meant that one does not and should not choose between political gods embodied in ideologies and political projects. It's important to note here that Said's secularism is not opposition to religion, rather nationalism, that Said regards as a form of religion that requires obedience, submission, accompanied with the cult of the enemy, and of course loyalty, and blind loyalty. By drawing attention to the resemblance of religion and nationalism, or to be more accurate, nationalism and other forms of communal belonging, as form of religion, Said challenges the modernist assumption that secular nationalism would eventually replace religion as an ideology that unites people of various sectarian and ethnic affiliation, or what is known the myth of the primordial attachments, thus creating an inclusive supra-communal identity. Not only that secular nationalists have used sectarian communitarianism as a basis for nation building, and we have many examples in the Balkans, in Greece, in Turkey, Pakistan, and ultimately Israel, among others, but Said's claim goes as far as to assert that nationalism as a form of religion, because all nationalisms, he says, quote, have their founding fathers, their basic quasi-religious texts, their rhetoric of belonging, their historical and geographical landmarks, their official enemies and heroes, unquote. Traits that were also common in the experience of the crowd that sought the Baptist in the wilderness. The way Said positions religious ideology and nationalism as parallel explains his method of criticism, where he sees not to validate the status quo of preconceived institutional truths and not to join up with the priestly, that's his words, priestly caste of acolytes and dogmatic metaphysicians. Here I would like to highlight Said's choice of words as he continues to invoke religious lexicon, priestly, caste of acolytes, dogmatic, religious texts, official enemies, etc., to further the idea that nationalism is in itself a form of religion that requires a kind of loyalty and obedience that is destined to hinder criticism. It is in this mindset that Said's position his criticism as secular. Said further suggests toward the end of the essay that were to use one word consistently along with criticism, it would be oppositional, which some have preferred to drop the word secular and call Said's critical practice oppositional criticism because of the problematics of the word secular as I've described. Gil al-Najjar, for example, argues that Said was oppositional to the extent that he was also attacking victorious causes. Secularism itself for An-Najjar is victorious ideology that is at the heart of the Western myth of modernity, civilization, and progress. From an anti-colonial perspective, secularism assumes the superiority of one form of rationalized values such as human rights, international law, democracy, and other liberal values that everyone should follow. In other words, it continues to serve as yet another mission civilistaris that subverts imperial and exploitative ideologies. In contemporary politics, Western secularism as a civilizing project renders the religious practices of others as illegitimate nationalism, represented as a form of primitivism, militarism, terrorism, and posing more imminent threat to quote-unquote our values of progress, rationality, democracy, modernity, and democracy, and currently security. So by secular criticism, Said really meant oppositional. I kept it in the title, however, and I put it between quotes because I was interested in the contrast between using a figure of a saint like John the Baptist with secular. So the idea of oppositional criticism has important implications for the writing and interpretation of historical events. Such criticism rejects triumphalism and its assumptions that victory in itself is the proof of superiority. Said gives the example of nationalism as an ideology that dictates a selective writing of history, narrating events retrospectively as progressing towards an inevitable victory. And this is, in a way, I'm also thinking of Walter Benjamin's thesis of history as he criticizes the idea of the beads of a rosary as an image of linear progression of history. Said envisions this in light of Walter Benjamin's rejection of the view of human history as dichotomy between progress and decline, between civilization and barbarism. So in the second Wreath lecture, Said positions the intellectual as having to continuously choose between allying with the stability of the victors and rulers, or to consider that stability as a state of emergency threatening the less fortunate, this is a quote, with the danger to complicate extinction and take into account the experience of subordination itself, as well as the memory of forgotten voices and persons, unquote. Said goes on in the lecture and quotes Benjamin's thesis 6 on the philosophy of history, and he quotes the line that says, "To articulate the past is to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger." In a broader sense, Said's secularity is not one that is opposed to religion and nationalism per se, but rather something that is against conformity associated with a strong sense of belonging, being housed, settled, comfortable, and entitled. Here I want to highlight the concepts of filiation and affiliation from Said's essay, Secular Criticism, to highlight the relationship of the critic to the people or to the subject of criticism. Said makes the distinction between filiation and affiliation in the way that the intellectual relates to society and power. Filiation, he says, is one's natal culture that has natural bonds that one does not choose. One is born into it. It is a form of belonging that is taken for granted and involves traditional authority that requires submission to obedience, fear, love, respect, and instinctual conflict. Affiliation, on the other hand, is one's conscious choice of belonging where one chooses to form new relationships and bonds. In summary, filial belongs to the realm of nature and life, while affiliation belongs exclusively to culture and society. It is wordly embedded in one historical moment, while, of course, the filial is more frozen. Yet such distinction is not an either-or choice, as they work in cooperation with each other. This is because criticism, Said says, is always situated, it is skeptical, secular, reflectively open to its own failings. In other words, criticism is a practice in two areas. The first one is where one could maintain a stance against two opposition ideologies at the same time, like, for example, what I spoke of, being critical of the Shah and the Imam at the same time, refusing both fascism and imperialism at the same time, or Islamists and military dictatorships on another. And the second, one could maintain belonging to a group while being critical of its hegemonic institutions and maintaining solidarity with and for the marginalized, the oppressed, and the vulnerable. This position Said speaks of as the intellectual exile, as it is self-imposed, where one feels unsettled and unadjusted and on the margins of one's own society. Here we consider forced or self-imposed exile not as hindrance and challenge, but as a creative opportunity to critique, a vantage point that offers a perspective about one's own life and society that would not have been possible in the comfort zone of home. An aspect that Said emphasizes in the life of Erich Auerbach as how his exile in Istanbul led to the completion of one of the most important texts in philology, Mimesis. Exile is a privileged position, because Mimesis, in a way, he was exiled from Europe, but the entire work was about Europe. So in a way, Said says that being exiled at the same time maintaining a critical stance to that which that one belongs to in a filial way. So then he says that the relationship of Auerbach to Europe was filial because he was born a European, but he then later affiliated with it through his engagement with literary texts. So exile is a privileged position because simply one does not have much to lose. John the Baptist had nothing to lose except his life. He could not be threatened to lose his job, property, exile, or tenure at an academic institution. The Baptist belonged to the Jewish community in Palestine through his filiation, his natal culture, yet through his self-imposed exile in the wilderness, he also engages another level of affiliation through his critical consciousness of his society of birth. But choice of affiliation meant that he would side with the ordinary and the marginalized and severely critiqued structures of power. Then the cooperation between filiation and affiliation, Said says, is, quote, located at the heart of critical consciousness. John's message was not take their filial belonging of not to take the filial belonging of his society uncritically. Against the odds of his society at the time, where the Jewish community felt entitled to be special and superior to their surroundings just because they are children of Abraham. Their bloodline, their filiation, was not enough to boast how special they were, because he told them that out of these worthless stones, God is capable of creating children of Abraham. John was then hitting a sensitive chord for the communal sense of triumphalist belonging of his community that is built on filial belonging. This is something that he himself denied to himself by choosing to be in the wilderness as a voice that is critical of people's narcissism and that is hidden behind religiosity, as well as religious and secular leaders of his time. The covenant with Abraham, John would think, was not unconditional and was not eternal. John reminded his disciples that it was worldly and historical and dependent on people's fulfilling their part of it. It is conditionally embedded in history, undermining the filial belonging of the past in order to lead them as a precursor, as a forerunner, to conscious choice of affiliation and solidarity by changing their way of life to one that does not abuse and manipulate as the quotation from Luke that I spoke earlier of. This transforms his criticism into the virtue of maintaining distance, a state of being unhoused, in between contradictory worlds, and ultimately exiled from the convenience of conformity and the comfort of belonging. Quoting Adorno, Said upheld the ethic that it is part of morality not to be at home in one's own home. The self-exile, basically. He sees the duty of the secular or the oppositional intellectual as to show the absence of divine originality, these are his words, and on the side, the complex presence of historical actuality. In his book, Beginnings, Intention, and Method, Said makes a distinction between origin and beginnings, very much like he makes the distinction between the filiation and the affiliation. Origin for him was monolithic, linear, divine, with a specific point of origin and a particular teleological destiny. Beginnings, on the other hand, is in the plural, which is traceable to multiple human-made sources, multifocal and multivocal. The oppositional intellectual does not read history as a divinely destined story of civilization, rendering others, especially enemies, barbaric. The absence of the divine is an invitation to contemplate events of history and the social world in an undogmatic worldly fashion, critical of ideologies that legitimizes power as well as the triumphalism of institutional historiographies. The oppositional critic is inevitably a radical historian, says Abdurrahman Hussein in his intellectual biography of Said, whose writing produce, quote, counter-histories that subvert received wisdom and are written against the grain of self-contained traditions of founding father and exclusive canons, unquote, that flourish on the polarized view of the world, the inferiority of an outsider enemy, and the exaggerated importance of one's own nation, group, and tribe. While the intellectual should not choose between competing binaries of power, this does not mean total avoidance of engaging and speaking truth to power, which again, a sentence that he used in his Wreath lecture. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Truth to Said must be, quote, represented by an unafraid and compassionate intellectual. One cannot be afraid to seem controversial and political and should not seek a reputation to be objective and moderate in order to be invited and consulted by think tanks, government agencies, or powerful lobbies. Said's insistence of his oppositional criticism is behind his refusal to take sides and to choose between political divinities. One is always on the side of the marginal and the oppressed, yet his oppositionality was still read by critics in a binary fashion. For example, being an advocate for Palestinian rights, Said once commented that his opinion was often disqualified. His criticism of Western hegemony was interpreted as blaming the West for all the evils of the world. And his condemnation of the Oslo Accord was perceived in a way that rendered him against peace and hope for a better future. Yet such partisan reading of history leaves no space for a third alternative, where, for example, one could be for coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians while insisting that negotiation and potential settlement should be enshrined in the recognition of historical injustices, the 1948 dispossession of Palestinians, the destruction of their society, the military occupation, the loss of individual and communal property, and the ongoing political and economic disenfranchisement of every Palestinian adult and child. Otherwise, the so-called peace process would be yet another political god that requires yet another form of obedience and servitude of the oppressed. The oppositional intellectual does not choose between gods, rather maintains this critical stance. John the Baptist, as a secular or oppositional critic, went from the people's ordinary practices to criticizing religious leaders of his community, and finally ended up by severely criticizing the Roman ruler of Palestine at the time on issues of justice and social morality as it was understood in his time. Luke narrates. But when John rebuked Herod, the Roman ruler, because of his marriage to Herodias, his brother's wife, which is not accepted in society and in Jewish law, and all the other evil things he has done basically in his rule, Herod added this to them all. He locked up John in prison. Despite the fact that the saint is central image of hegemonic religious institutions, being the Orthodox or Catholic churches, or even in Islamic doctrine, where he's considered to be an important prophet, but his life stands out as someone who was able to speak to power regardless of who is it. From the very little scriptural fragments about his life, he stood against his people's sense of entitlement, monopoly of interpretation, rejected the legalistic teachings of the religious institutions at the time, and the ruler of Palestine, who was not Jewish, but brought his end when he was basically beheaded. Said spoke about the value of Auerbach's work as representation in his approach to the life of Jesus, that is in my Mises as well, as quote. So that's Auerbach's rendition of the life of Jesus as destroying the separation between the sublime and the everyday, unquote. The secular and the profane. In The Storyteller, Benjamin describes Leskov as a writer who mixed the golden fabric of a religious view of the course of things and the multicolored fabric of a worldly view. Here I attempt to do a parallel reading of the life. I have attempted to do a parallel reading of John the Baptist through an alternative way of storytelling that rids the distinction between the religious and the worldly. Since the church institutions have focused on the persona of the Forerunner as sublime and theological, and not what he stood for as an oppositional critic, as a precursor, as a forerunner. So as critics and teachers, perhaps we should go beyond the dichotomy of the religious and the spiritual, and on one hand, and the worldly, by taking the entire human history and the complexity of human existence in its entirety. To denationalize or secularize criticism, or to be an oppositional critic, to secularize criticism is focus on power and not people, on hegemony itself and not the holder of it. Only then our calling is universal and inclusive and not likely to be abused by one or the other. A voice in a barren wilderness and not in red carpet receptions is what John the Baptist is all about. I believe that the Forerunner story is an invitation to be ourselves as precursors, as forerunners to others, to open new possibilities of criticism in the future. That's it. Thank you.
Questions? We have a little bit, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes. For question discussion, also beyond the scope of your notes. So, please.
A general question about everyone's processes. Because I heard you speak the last time, I'm very curious at how you made this kind of intellectual leap or link from a sort of critical historiography perspective in your Armenian paper concerning Armenian genocide, and then moving now to this biblical figure. I don't know if you care to speak a little bit about how you sort of got there, as it were.
I never imagined this question, but thank you very much for that, because I think it's a very good opportunity to reflect on my own intellectual genealogy, beginnings and not origin. But obviously, I think the last paper was, in a way, speaks about the importance of critical historiography as bringing in the silenced voices in order to critique not only nationalist historiography, but the way we imagine the region, like the Middle East and the Balkan, as post-colonial regions. So basically, it is a critique of the center from the vantage point of the marginal, right? Because Armenians, in a way, are marginal in Turkey, marginal in Middle East studies, completely marginal from the Balkans, and only situated within the genocide studies or diaspora studies. So the group that I work on, the Armenian survivors in post-genocide Turkey, are invisible not only in Turkish historiography, but also in Armenian historiography, and that's the interesting. This is where anthropology comes in and help the production of critical historical knowledge. So I would say that both of them have beginnings with the work of Edward Said, particularly his Wreath lectures that got published in the representations of the intellectual. So in a way, I take it as a form of academia for me in general, as a form of activism. You know, the very act of re-narrating, the act of teaching and being engaged critically, that is a political act, right? It is. I don't believe in the distinction between the political and the non-political, because I don't believe that there is anything that could be non-political anyway. The minute we are engaged in producing texts that are publishable, we become publicly engaged and politically engaged and take sides, basically. But I'm also fascinated in a kind of a liberation theology that accompanied the work of Said, because I've always felt equally uncomfortable with the kind of the secularity of the critiques of Said. It frustrates me at some point. So I feel that there is a lot of wisdom and methodology of being and critiquing from a text like the Gospel. The fact that hegemonic institutions have used it for building empires and building institutions and building orthodoxies and rendering everyone a heretic does not mean that we shouldn't engage with the text in order to critique the very tradition from within, organically from within. So that would be also a way of critiquing the church institutions.
I'm really still not quite clear. I heard a brilliant exposition of Said's critical or critical theory, which I think was excellent. But then, John the Baptist into this, I still don't see the logic of it. And I very respectfully, the reason John the Baptist is, as you put it, famously or part of a long-standing 2,000-year tradition, which we call hegemonic, and which in many ways is not because of his nature as a critic. It's because of the other things that are also related in the gospel that you chose to use as a source for your whole theory. Mm-hmm. There are whole parts about John that we don't include here, because they related to his birth and his naming and what should have gone through those. But you chose to not worry about those, so now you're creating your own version of John the Baptist, if you want, or your own aspect of his mm-hmm. life. So why? Why do you need to do that? If it's not going to be in order because is a name that everybody recognizes for something else that you're not going to talk about, which is from the same source.
Okay.
So I still don't see here the motivation for invoking John the Baptist, other than, like invoking John Lennon, a famous name, and maybe I could find something there that's also a critique, and I'm sure you could.
Okay, thank you for this question. I think maybe I haven't given enough justification for why I chose John the Baptist and not maybe any of the prophets from the Hebrew Scriptures that were also speaking of it, but of issues of social justice. But I definitely am retelling the story of John the Baptist. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm retelling a story of a biblical figure that is also considered to be important in the gospel because he was the forerunner before the coming of the Messiah. So his importance in the gospel and the mainstream Christian tradition comes from the fact that he was a messianic forerunner. But I felt that his teachings are extremely important and ignored in the Christian tradition. So we look at him as a forerunner for the Messiah, but not as himself a voice in the wilderness. I was personally, this is a personal story, that my interest in John the Baptist are not others. I don't have other reason why I chose John the Baptist, except that at one point I came across the line that, and don't consider yourself, don't say to yourselves that you are children of Abraham, because God can create out of these stones children of Abraham. And I feel that in a nutshell, this is one of the most powerful lines I've read in the gospel.
As you're saying, he was calling for people to change your ways, be better people, which all the other prophets were saying.
Yes.
There was something
Yes.
else that was a real game changer.
Yes.
And the game changer is summarized in some way what you said about that now, the whole Abraham thing is over.
Yes.
Somebody's coming who's going to change
Yes.
things. It's not over, but it's done with. Now, out of stones you can create.
Absolutely.
So that's a major shift of the ground. But that's really related so very much to who he was as a person, not just for his
Yes.
approach.
Yeah, but let me tell you also that what he said was again not new in the prophetic tradition. I mean, when you read the prophetic tradition, Amos, for example, you will and others, you will find that he was telling people, God doesn't need your rituals and your whatever you have to offer. God wants mercy, wants justice. Seek justice. So this is, I think, a very important aspect of the New Testament. But again, through the New Testament, I could have considered the Quran, or I could have considered the Hebrew Scriptures as a point of departure to highlight the marginalized verses that leaders choose not to. The other thing that I feel that when I rediscovered John the Baptist was the idea of the intellectual exile in Said, where you choose to reject the kind of comfort and honors that society gives you, and you choose to be in the wilderness as a voice criticizing without fear. So, and this is a theme in Said's writings, where he spoke, as I said in the paper, about the importance of being from Adorno, basically. It's part of morality not to be at home in one's own home. So it's a kind of a self-exile that the intellectual takes, and that's the responsibility to continuously criticize power. Now, power continues to shift, and it is the duty of the intellectual to shift the criticism as power continue to shift. Okay? Now, a third thing that I'm thinking of as well, that in the past few years in the region, I think we have a lot of, I haven't seen enough intellectuals in the Arab world that were able to articulate a kind of a criticism to the various hegemonic voices that we are encountering, by basically choosing to take side with one because that one is bad but would be worse than the other. Okay, and I feel that there is, I think it's a problematic in our societies and in any society for intellectuals to choose between gods, because so far all the gods that the intellectuals have worshipped have so far failed. From the military, from Islamism, from Arab nationalism, from sectarian polities, you name it, they have failed. So what is to come, I don't know. But it is this kind of critique as a lifestyle, I would say. So I hope this answers your question a little bit. Thank you. Yes.
First of all, thank you for this enriching lecture. I have two questions. I'm going to say them, both of them. First of all, there's a gray area in John the Baptist's life, which is his relationship with the Essenes, with the scrolls found in the Dead Sea. So maybe this gray area allows for us to highlight the relationship of secularism and non-believers, because in many areas, especially in our countries, secularists and secular people are being accused of being non-believers. And this is a big thing.
Yeah. Same in Egypt, by the way.
In Egypt, in Lebanon, or anywhere else. So this is one. The other question that I would like to say here, it's the relationship with the power symbols. You mentioned in some place the god of politics, or this deity, meaning, especially in our countries again, that everyone who's dealing with politics, or is in some area, we tend to view him as a god, and we do not contradict him, or we just follow him blindly. So in Mark, for instance, it shows that John the Baptist has a good relationship with Herod the king, because when Herodias asked for his head, the king, the text says,
True.
The king was sad,
Yes.
because he had a good relationship with John the Baptist. So can you just elaborate a bit on these 2 points, meaning the relationship between secularism and being a believer first, and second, the relationship of secularism and the power? In some instances, there could be a relationship between them.
I'm not familiar with those fragments that were found, by the way. I don't know what they've said about John the Baptist. That's, I have a feeling that John the Baptist might be an ongoing project with Walter Benjamin, and then I don't know what happens in 10 years. But I think he didn't want to behead him at the beginning. I haven't personally interpreted as because he had a good relationship with him. I think Matthew says that he feared. He was popular, and he feared him as well, of the reaction of the people, because not only that people were following John the Baptist, but he was also criticizing the king. And the last thing, so he was, I would say as a ruler, he probably wanted to balance these two. The jail as a compromise. And it took the Salome's dance to push the king. So that's my reading of it, but I don't know. I think more of engaging with biblical scholarship would highlight a lot of things about John the Baptist. For example, the idea that since John baptized Jesus, it means that Jesus was a disciple of John, to the extent that I'm now thinking about it, that when Jesus asked the disciples, who do people think I am? They asked, some of you say you are John the Baptist risen from the dead.
Even Herod said that.
Even Herod said that, yeah. So basically, there were, in a way, their lives converged. where the biblical scholarships would say that John, after John died, Jesus became the head of the new community. So basically, the early Christian community was the community of John the Baptist, and that it continued. And we only hear that only after John's death that the disciples of John, the Gospels tell us, followed Jesus. So up until his beheading, John's disciples did not think that they needed to follow Jesus as the Messiah. I mean, so there is a lot of question marks about it. Yes?
Isn't John the Baptist the person who's credited with perhaps the only reference or the first reference to Jesus as the Lamb of God?
Yes.
Yes, but only in John.
Only in John?
Only in the Gospel of John.
Because that's interesting as well, in terms of this disciple kind of relationship. To both be a disciple, but yet to mark a very clear break by announcing him as...
But the Gospels do not want us to think about Jesus as a disciple of John.
Actually, the Gospel is clear in this. When the Gospel mentions that ينبغي له أن يزيد وأنا أنقص, which is
that I, yeah.
Even him, John, he told the other John and his brother that go to Jesus and ask him if he's the one that we should follow. And we see in the Gospel that this idea is a bit clarified, but the scholars, they try to develop a bit more on
yes, of course
they have their reasons. Maybe they are based on these scrolls of Qumran, which it's a bit controversial.
Yeah, it is controversial. Yeah. If you approach it from like an orthodox way, an orthodox, not as Orthodox Church, but an orthodox interpretation of the text, it is. But I don't find it problematic to think about Jesus being a disciple, especially that Jesus did basically everything else that people did at the time in his society. Why are we coming to this and say, no, he cannot be a disciple because he's the Messiah? So, I mean, it doesn't. But then also thinking about Lukács as the essayist being a precursor to new ways of being and new ways of criticism, we can think about the role of John the Baptist as a precursor for Jesus, and Jesus as a precursor for others, and then eventually we can think about the responsibility or the life of the oppositional intellectual is to not to hegemonize, rather to give birth or to allow space for others to be and think and critically and open new possibilities of thought. So we can, this is how I'm trying to think about their lives as a way to, the way that people should also allow space for the people to discover their own voices, their own ways to critique, and not follow something blindly without the creative aspect in it. So that's also a concern of mine, I think. But about the secular, your question about the secular and the non-believers, what is the question again?
Well, maybe they accuse seculars of being non-believers.
Yes.
In our countries.
Yes.
John had a different model. He was a big believer, but at the same time he was a secular. So in many cases you can harmonize these two concepts.
Yeah, if we take that's a very good point to highlight. That's the reason why we can speak about secular criticism as oppositional criticism. So obviously, you can think about, for example, the Soviet Union was secular because they didn't have a religion. But the way the state was worshipped and the writings of Marx and Lenin were worshipped, that's a form of religion. Very much like countries like Turkey can think about themselves as secular, yet it is the mono-ethnic model of the nation that is being worshipped, and not. So in that sense, Said uses the idea of the political deity, so the gods that always fail, in order to make the point of that nationalism and blindly following any kind of teaching, be it religious or not. That's not the point. It is the way things do. So yes, so people can practice a religion and be an oppositional or a secular critic, while others can be secular, but their secularism becomes a form of religion that requires, it's very much like the French model, that everyone should be the same, no diversity in the way they, and that's why they've been having problems in inclusion of immigrants because of this monocentric view of society. So it is basically, opposition is also to allow for the multivocal, the plural society in that sense. Thank you. Any more questions?
I have a couple of questions, but I think you shall go first. Just basically only some questions concerning understanding. So, John, I really like your close reading of, or like a parallelism, you can say, of a close reading of Edward Said and John the Baptist. So, I understand, as non-biblically schooled as I am, John the Baptist is a critic of filiation, insofar as he said, the quote was mentioned, so the Abrahamic lineage is not the determinate line of filiation. So he is basically someone who, from the position of affiliation, Wahlverwandtschaft, elective affinities, the Goethean concept almost, can criticize from the position of inner exile, being part of non-part because he is part of a community, but also non-part because he's on the margins, he's in the woods or in the wilderness. From there, which is his inner exile within a community as affiliation. He is a critic. So he is a critic of filiation. And his secularism, so to speak, is only the one oppositional because he is also vis-a-vis state power, state, let's put it, the king is not a state in our modern sense. But one point I'm a bit critical of is the concept of the Forerunner. So the Forerunner, as you beautifully showed, is precisely the perspective of those Gospels who want to glorify Jesus. So Jesus needs a Forerunner. But the reading you gave us is, especially in terms of social justice, which is a strong element in John the Baptist, that he's actually not a Forerunner. On his own terms, he is a runner. You can say he is even a late runner, or he is a runner that steps out of line. So Forerunner is only the perspective, if you have a teleological view from here to there. So I would even say, as a critic, precisely he's not a Forerunner. He maybe even questions the very concept of forerunning. I mean, I could not help but think of modern history. You mentioned Soviet Union, of course, this is a kind of dirty joke, but what do you think? Lenin is to Stalin a forerunner? And now I think of Trotsky. If he would have been killed, beheaded, so to speak, in the war with the white troops, in the civil war after 17, he would have been a forerunner of Stalin. He would have been, but he was not, as we know the story goes quite a bit different. So the idea of forerunners is always a perspective of power. I mean, also when the codification of Christian theology was done, what is part of the Bible, what is apocryph, what we should accept. Also the retroactive reading that Paul does, St. Paul with the Jewish prophets and then Jesus, in the end they're all forerunners for Jesus. You know, this kind of perspective is then the perspective of power. And what you gave us a reading where I don't want to qualify them as being either Jewish or non-Jewish or Hellenistic Jews or none. I mean, we have this reading of Agamben where their belonging is, but these people are a counter-power, so not with power. So it's actually a perspective that is against the form, you could say.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree with you. And that's why precisely I said that I'm going to, I'm basing it on the biblical narrative and not biblical scholarship.
I see.
Because obviously, and that's why I hinted to the point that the biblical scholarship, in order to put, John the Baptist was very important, but in order to emphasize the importance of Jesus in the narrative, he was made into a forerunner. And that's why they say, because of the certain biblical evidence that exists, that he was actually not his forerunner, but he was Jesus was his disciple. And after John was beheaded, that he continued the same kind of life, because Jesus also was on the fringes of society. He did not. He was a critic of false religiosity, religious institutions, the literal interpretation and monolithic interpretation of texts of the scriptures at the time, and so on and so forth. So it is written from, absolutely, it is written from the point of revisiting the past from the concern of the power present at the time. And you feel that the most in the Gospel of Matthew, because Matthew was written to a Jewish community. So unlike the rest. So Matthew's audience were Jews, and that's why whenever something happens, he says, and that's according to the prophet who said, and then a quotation. And then of course you have the threat that Jesus had when he was a child, when he had to leave to Egypt.
Yes.
It's only in Matthew. Because it's the Jews that were in Egypt, and he was speaking to them. So Jesus was then the new Moses who came out of Egypt, right? And when he started preaching, the Sermon on the Mount is only a Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. It existed fragments in other Gospels, because, and then the image that we get that, and he stood on a mountain and he started preaching. The new Moses. Yeah. So yes, so there is that. The Gospels are storytellers, because they are leading, each narrative in the Gospel leads the reader into one conclusion. Now, which one is true and which one isn't is not the concern. In my opinion, as we were talking earlier, the factual is not the important here, but basically the essence, or the not the essence as much as the spirit of the text of what it's trying to tell us. But the idea of being a forerunner, where someone, and this is from Said's the word, the text, and the critic, where he quotes Lukács, where the forerunner leads to a revolution that makes the person basically disappears, because he leads to something that is greater than himself. That image, I feel, is very attractive.
You can use this exactly if you think of Fred Jameson's article, The Vanishing Mediator.
Okay.
So it's not a forerunner. Forerunner is only, he will have been, future past, a forerunner. History will be told about him as a forerunner, but actually a vanishing mediator. So, which is also kind of no one wants to be that, right?
No.
You have, in a very nasty Hegelian reading, you have fulfilled your course. No, in history, now you can vanish. I mean, especially after the history of 20th century, it's kind of an uncanny concept. But it's an amazing essay by, I think, Frederick Jameson. Yes. So, he's not the vanishing mediator of Jesus, of course, John the Baptist.
He still has followers. There are still a small sect that follows John the Baptist, by the way.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, of course.
What is the name of them?
No. They are they are called Sabaeans, I think. Yeah, the followers of John the Baptist. If you Google it, you will find they even have. It's in Iraq and even in the U.S. after migration.
They are a dying breed.
They are a dying breed, but they've survived up until now. He never.
So they're not so big, huh?
No, they're not so big. And they use apparently Arabic and Muslim names. They don't consider themselves basically as part of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam for that matter.
Yeah, of course,
And they have their own. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Some of them believe that basically the followers of Jesus hijacked the message of John the Baptist by making him the Messiah. Some of them feel that have a more positive image of Jesus. So no, they haven't.
With the scholarship, I'm just thinking in Quranic studies now, the kind of the new thing is moving the field in the direction of thinking through typology, right? As sort of Christian hermeneutic tradition. Would typology help you? Because typology is all about this idea of forerunners and fulfillment, figures who fulfill, precursors, or if you like, prefigure the coming of Christ. I don't know whether that might be something useful to think about, sort of theoretically, and also together with the text.
Yes, definitely.
The composition.
Definitely, and now thinking about it, also, Sami, if you about basically reinterpreting the past as foreshadowing to the future after it happens. If you read the Gospel of John, it's all about that, and the narrator says it. So after Jesus' resurrection, the disciples understood what he meant, and then you would say, so it reinterprets. It says. Basically, the methodology of the Gospel of the writer of John explicitly says, or does it without wanting to appear to have happened like the other Gospels. The other
past.
Yeah, the other Gospels say narrate it in a linear way. John is a fascinating text, but he does that. Yeah, only after when he said that they understood it after. So even the recognition of him as the Messiah was not achieved except after the cross and the resurrection. After he disappeared, he became the Messiah. Yes. So everything he taught was rewritten with the idea of the recognition of the Messiah, because the first Gospels were basically orally transmitted.
Yes.
Thank you. I think we have an interesting
On
lecture.
time, 5 o'clock. Thank you. So we still have some refreshments.